Poor mental health is perhaps the biggest health problem facing the world today. In Europe, nearly half the population reported an emotional or psychological problem in 2023. In 2022, the OECD found the proportion of the population reporting symptoms of depression was 20% higher than pre-COVID. This human crisis translates into a massive economic challenge, with mental health problems costing an average European economy 4% of its GDP.
Like with any medical condition, we look to specialists to diagnose and define the health problem so we can understand, treat, and hopefully cure the condition. But in mental health, there is a problem.
Currently, defining which mental health condition someone has is more an art than a science. Diagnosis is normally made by a doctor, perhaps a specialist psychiatrist or clinical psychologist, asking the patient a series of questions and then using the answers to these questions to define which condition they have. Mostly these questions come from a preset guidance designed to probe a specific mental health condition. The most commonly used guide is the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, developed and curated since the 1950s by the American Psychiatric Association. But, unlike in many other areas of medicine, this process does not require any measurement of anything biological, such as blood pressure, sugar in the urine, the size of a tumor, or the mechanical efficiency of the lungs.
As a consequence, a mental health diagnosis based on this guide does not actually tell us what's biologically wrong with the patient. Diagnosis is only based on the symptoms the doctors observe. So this is done entirely on how you are perceived by the clinician sitting in front of you. There are no biological tests like there are in other medical specialties. It's not done by measuring brain function or the results from a blood test.
But many mental health conditions have symptoms in common. For example, an inappropriate response to stress is a symptom common to bipolar syndrome, major depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, as well as other conditions. Almost certainly in all cases, it is the same biological system that is responsible for this part of a patient's symptoms. The DSM manual, though, tells us that these are all different conditions and, in many cases, different treatments are recommended. This means we can then end up trying to treat the symptoms rather than the underlying cause. If instead we tried to treat the biological causes, we may be able to treat the conditions more effectively.
If we know the causes, it's much easier for drug discovery scientists to design medicines that specifically target the condition. But this lack of awareness means that recently very few drugs for mental health disorders have been developed. However, there was a golden age of drug discovery back in the 1950s, 1960s and 1970s when the antipsychotics, antidepressants and anxiolytics were first developed.
Unfortunately, these treatments still don't work well for all patients. Nor have we been able to introduce any major new class of treatment since then. Around 10 years ago, a group of drug development scientists working in industry began to discuss how we could address this problem and hopefully trigger a new golden age of drug innovation. Subsequently, a call for proposals was launched by EU's Innovative Medicines Initiative, the IMI. A group of interested academics put forward a proposal and formed a consortium with the industry partners to address the call. This consortium was awarded the IMI funding for this call, and this was the start of the PRISM project. The aim? To look at and understand symptoms which appear transdiagnostically, the same symptom seen in several diagnoses. In other words, to try to understand the biological process behind symptoms which are common to different brain disorders. The gradual introduction of objective biological tests has revolutionized other areas of medicine, giving startling improvements in outcomes. From the start of this century, we have seen significant drops in mortality in cardiovascular disease, cancer, AIDS, and many other conditions. These positive effects were achieved by understanding more about the underlying biological causes, allowing more treatments to be developed which are more specific, and enabling early intervention. To take an example, a diagnosis that someone has breast cancer means something, but it is much more useful if you can identify that you have breast cancer driven by a HER2 mutation. This tells you how you can treat the specific cancer. But the numbers for mental health go in the other direction. The burden of mental health disorders has slowly increased over the last 35 years. Recently, with the global pandemic and the associated societal changes, the upward trend seems to be accelerating, particularly in depression and anxiety-related disorders. So the question was, what could we learn from the successes in other fields of medicine which might help those with mental health problems?
PRISM was a mental health experiment that nobody had ever attempted before. We took patients living with Alzheimer's disease, schizophrenia, as well as healthy controls, and subjected them to intensive examination. The subjects were put through a whole range of tests, including fMRI scans, EEG analysis, tests of cognition including working memory and attention, as well as assessments of biomarkers from blood. The subjects also downloaded a mobile phone app that enabled us to monitor what they were doing, when and where, for several weeks through the study. In this way, we collected a huge amount of data that enabled us to begin to focus down on what markers were linked with the various different symptoms in these subjects.
We focused on one main symptom that was common across all groups, namely social dysfunction. In that situation, people exhibit reduced social interactions and less engagement in social activity. They become socially isolated. In part 1 of the PRISM project, we were able to show that social dysfunction is linked transdiagnostically to decreased connectivity in one of the brain's network, the default mode network. In other words, everyone in our patient group who exhibited social dysfunction had reduced connectivity in the default mode brain network, a measurable biological basis for a mental health condition. This was an exciting finding which led the Innovative Medicine Initiative to fund us for a second investigation, PRISM 2. PRISM 2 extended the work on schizophrenia and Alzheimer's to include major depression, and crucially, efforts to back-translate the work to animals to test for causality.
PRISM 2 succeeded in replicating the PRISM 1 default mode network finding, and also showed that this finding could be extended to major depression. Thus, the same physiological relationship between the level of connectivity in a brain neural circuit and social dysfunction is seen in people living with schizophrenia, Alzheimer's, major depression, or indeed healthy controls who also suffer from social dysfunction. There's a common underlying biology to social dysfunction.
The next step was interesting. We have been able to show that social dysfunction in mice is also regulated by the brain network which modulate this activity in humans. This gave us the opportunity to manipulate these neuronal networks, which of course we couldn't do in humans. And we found that by modifying the activity in these neural networks in mice, we could change their level of social functioning.
Being able to specifically manipulate the behavior in mice by changing the biology indicates that human behavior too is dependent on their underlying biology. We are already beginning to see psychiatrists take this idea on board. From a drug development point of view, this gives us real biological targets we can aim new drugs at.
This also holds out the hope that in the future people won't be stigmatized by suffering from mental health problems such as schizophrenia, anxiety and depression. They will be seen as having a biological imbalance, and changing that imbalance may give effective treatment.
So, what are the next steps for the PRISM project?
Important next studies will have to reveal how and where in the brain default mode network changes occur that will lead to social dysfunction. Also enhancing clinical trials by applying the newly developed endpoints such as the smartphone-based digital endpoint for social functioning and the brain connectivity measures will provide the basis for a more precise biology-informed diagnosis and treatment development for these conditions with a very high unmet need.
This is the first work of its kind, but it shows that we can identify the underlying biological causes of mental disorders in the same way as we can do that for physical disorders such as heart disease and cancer. If we can much better understand the biology of mental health disorders, then we're well on the road to developing novel treatments that offer much better opportunities to those living with mental health disorders than are available today. PRISM shows that if you're brave about mental health, then you can make real progress.